I've got a small 7 by 10 inch watercolor of an Oblong Wool Carder Bee on Sedum. Last summer and fall, I was sidelined with some health issues that didn't allow me to spend my usual time cycling. I ended up spending a lot more time doing macro photography. It's amazing how much goes unnoticed until you take the time to look. I was really thrilled to find a rich variety of insects and spiders right in our yard. These Oblong Wool Carder Bees really captivated me, and I was excited to paint this guy. This watercolor was done on a block of Arches 140-pound hot press paper. Prior to the recording, I frisketed off the foreground elements. Wanting a blurry, low depth of field look, I planned on a wet-on-wet wash. I pre-mixed some greens, making a saturated lighter option with lemon yellow and phthalo green, and a less saturated version with ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow, and some pinks made with quinacridone magenta and dioxazine purple. I pre-wet the paper with a 1-inch flat brush, making sure it was evenly saturated. Hot press paper is especially fussy about absorbing a wash, so I checked it many times to make sure no sections were drying out faster than others and re-wet it until it was evenly glossy. Once ready, I switched to a number 6 round and first brought in my darker, less saturated green, followed by my quinacridone magenta, in an almost splotchy pattern that will mimic distant blossoms. The water on the paper will help these move around and blur on the page. I worked on the most distant portions first, so those would blur the most, and work down the page. As the paper slowly dries, the newer pinks and greens added will travel less and look like they're coming into focus. With my first pass done, I re-wet the top to add in some definition between some of the layers of blossoms. Afterwards, I added some darker greens to get a few sharper edges and build a bit of depth. Often suggesting detail rather than rendering a lot in backgrounds works better. In most of my paintings, I like having a few layers from the most distant background working forward with separate sections at different levels of detail, color, and saturation. As the foreground comes in later, your brain tends to fill in a lot of detail that you don't have to actually render. Here I faked in some sections of blurry flowers with green bases in the background. To my eye, it was already starting to look more dimensional. Now it's time to work forward into the scene, adding more contrast, detail, sharper edges, and increased color saturation. I did this on dry paper using a number 2 round brush. I'd occasionally use the hairdryer so I didn't smudge things. I wasn't looking all that much at my reference photos and was faking in a lot of the information, trying to simply block in bigger shapes suggesting tufts of flowers rather than trying to render every petal. Honestly, blocking in the backgrounds like this one is one of the most fun parts of painting because everything goes in quickly. I think the trick is trying to make it look loose and fresh while still intentional and visually logical. I hit the midground with the hairdryer and then decided to re-wet the most distant section of the background in order to add a bit more green to separate it from the middle ground more. At that point, I thought the background was developed enough to remove the frisket. After that, I transferred the foreground sketch details to the watercolor block using a tracing paper transfer. The white of the page always looks pretty glaring and stark, so I try to cover up as much white as quickly as possible. I used a number 2 round to paint in the sepals on the bases of the flowers. Afterwards, I put in a layer of unifying shadows to develop the general lighting using a mix of ultramarine blue and dioxazine violet. That was already looking better than the white of the page. I hit the foreground with the hairdryer. Now it was time to establish the lightest local colors on the bee. I mixed in some browns and grays for the wing, and then used some burnt sienna, yellow ochre for the legs. Lemon yellow was the base coat for the bee. Some of the darker areas were rendered with a mix of ultramarine blue, dioxazine violet, and Indian red. For the reflections of our unseen sky color, I brought in a bit of phthalo blue to the mix. Later, I'll incorporate more of that color to the shadows. On the wings, I brought in some rich browns made with burnt sienna and alizarin crimson. After that, I spent a lot of time using my pre-mixed pinks from the background to start rendering some detail on the foreground flowers. After those glazes of pink went in, I started adding some yellow-green details to the flowers and their stems. It was time to get back to rendering some detail on the bee, starting with the eye, bringing in some orange colors and greenish shading. I followed that up with a coat of the next darker colors for the legs and body with some chrome orange and burnt sienna on the yellowish parts. I try to keep all the foreground developing in detail rather than just working on one section at a time. That left me switching repeatedly from the flowers to the bee and back again. It keeps things from getting dull, but it also means one section doesn't get neglected. I think for most people, rendering a bee is probably a lot more fun than painting the same sort of flower 100 times. Naturally, if one were to work on one section at a time, then the detail of the plant life wouldn't have been up to the same level as the insect. You'd be more likely to lose interest and focus on the less interesting, repeated plants. At the same time, all those flowers take up more square inches of the painting and are super important to the overall feel of the piece. The rhythm and pattern of all those pinks and whites and greens is part of what makes things compelling. So you want them to count just as much and not get neglected. By working across the page and developing things at the same time, you keep your enthusiasm up for all those secondary elements. Actually, it isn't even unusual for those secondary elements in the painting to become my favorite parts. They can be great places for injecting interesting color. You may periodically notice a white object with a lens on it appearing at the bottom of the video. For small details, I often wear a magnifying visor. My vision isn't what it used to be, and this allows me to really see detail when I need it. These paintings are quite small at 7 by 10 inches, so I really do need a macro view to render all the tiniest details accurately. For the darkest color on the bee, I used a lot of different colors, but never tube blacks. I made a dark with ultramarine blue and browns, either burnt sienna or Indian red, that saw a lot of use. And for the darkest areas, I made a blackish color with phthalo green and permanent alizarin crimson. This reads as blackish, but always has some sort of color personality to it. Tube blacks have a way of making things muddy, dull, and lifeless. Some grays were made with the same mixes were used for the bee's abdomen. Late in the painting, there was a lot of information that needed to be rendered on the flowers. The greens of their bases needed a lot of information. Also, once the lighter whites were rendered, I needed to bring in more intense pinks. There were a few areas where I needed to add more shadow on the flowers to help the bee pop out more and separate out the frontmost layers of the flowers. I did this with dioxazine violet and ultramarine blue in many different glazes of color. I decided to bring in more of the pinks to the foreground blossoms at this point. That should really help lead your eye through the page, with the saturation and darkness slowly fading as things move back in the frame. When doing the drawing for this painting, I wanted to prevent this from being just a boring bullseye composition with all the detail and interest in the middle of the page. I intentionally included numerous other items for the eye to investigate and rest on. I had one clump of blooming flowers going up from the bottom on the right that had some nice motion to it, and tried to bring in some extra saturated colors to the shadows and other portions of the flowers. You can see from the palette that late in the painting, I'm mixing my colors with less water and adding smaller details with darks. I chose to saturate the colors in the shadows for interest and to unify the page. I used some phthalo blue for the reflected light and the blacks of the bee, and used the same blue for many of the flower shadows. With almost all the work done with the sharp number 2 round brush, I switched to a 10-aught brush for some of the tiniest details, the eye, the antenna, sharpening up many of the sections of the abdomen, and to render in some tiny hairs. I switched back to my number 2 round brush as soon as possible because it just holds so much more paint. As I'm getting close to finish, you can see that my paints are getting really dark and saturated and are mixed with very little water. Late in the painting, I'm often looking for soft edges that need to be sharpened and little details that need tweaks. I decided to bring in some more intense blue shadows to separate out the foreground elements better. Those saturated colors should add more visual interest to compete with the bee and blossoms, inviting the viewer to explore additional areas of the page. Similarly, I intensified my greens in a few select areas before signing the painting, adding a few more sparks of color of super intense pinks, and then calling it quits. So there you go. A small 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor of an oblong wool carder bee on some sedum flowers. Thanks for taking the time to watch this painting take shape.